Hi, welcome to HRD Connect and Higher Rights panel discussion, Managing the Risks of Remote Working, featuring HR and legal perspectives on one of the most pressing issues facing leaders today. I'm Finn Murphy, HRD Connect's content manager, and I'll be your moderator. To ensure you get the most value out of this session, please ensure your audio setup is in full working order. Additionally, use On24's platform to ask questions to our panel, which will be answered during the end of the session. I'd invite our panel to introduce the topic and themselves. Thank you.
Hi there. So I'm Caroline Smith, and I'm Deputy General Counsel for Higher Rights, which is a background screening company. I've been in the business for around 12 years, and I'm just going to let my colleagues introduce themselves, or co-presenters, Michael and Yinka. Michael, do you want to go first?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Michael Spears. I'm Chief People Officer at London City Airport, the only airport actually in London.
Yinka? Yinka, I think you might be on mute.
Excuse me there. Yes, my name is Yinka. I'm the Group HR Director for Game Analytics. I'm responsible for overseeing the full gauntlet of the HR function within the company, and also for supporting some sister companies within the wider group of Modrica.
Super. Thanks, everyone. And I'm really glad we got in really early doors that somebody was on mute. That's not a video conference if we haven't had somebody being on mute. So that's fantastic. So just before we get into the meat of the session, 2020, I mean, what a year, or as I like to call it, the year that never was. I'm pretty sure no one could have predicted any of this, as we sort of saw in, January the 1st, I remember seeing lots and lots of sort of newspaper articles about, the new roaring 20s. But I think despite a year of Netflix, loungewear and hibernation, it's actually been a year of significant change. We've just gone through the US election, and there's going to be a huge change there out in the US with Joe Biden, we think, and depending on all the legal actions, being the new president. We've, of course, been living through Brexit at the same time as, all through this year in our transitional period. Liverpool managed to win the Premier League after however many years. And of course, we've got COVID. And with COVID, we've all started to work from home. And that's why we all wanted to have this kind of webinar, which is really to address or to discuss the risks of working from home in our new world. And as Finn said, please feel free to pop questions into the chat. We can either answer them as we go if they're pertinent to what we're talking about at the time, or we can answer them right at the very, very end. So working from home, I mean, I think originally it was a novelty, and there was a real focus initially on how on earth do we do this? Where do we get our laptops from? How on earth is this all going to happen? Then we kind of got all overexcited, and it was a total novelty, and there's quarantine is on Zoom. I mean, there's a real focus on well-being and, making sure everyone stayed connected. And then we started to think about risk once we got over that initial period. And I think one of the things that's occurred to me as we've traveled through the last however many months is that I didn't realize, as somebody who, traveled in and out of an office for 20 years, how much my work life and how much of my behavior within work is actually defined by my office space and by my commute and by that definition between my home life and my work life. And I think we're all consistently, and there's been some really amusing moments, I'm sure, in all of our lives where our home lives have peeled slightly into our working life. But with that lack of separation, there does become more risk because we are less aware of our kind of work cultural norms. We're more divorced from those cultural norms. So we really wanted to talk about what those risks are, how Yinka and Michael have both dealt with those in very differing sort of businesses, and then really taking any questions from you. So without further ado, we will go to the first poll question, which is, hang on, I think I need to move us to the first poll question. The first question, which is, do you believe that the move to remote working, this is the audience to answer, has increased the risk to your business? So Finn, if you could get that poll going. I'm not sure if the poll is working. The joys of technology. Okay. I think we'll see if I can see the results on the next slide. We may or may not be able to. Yes, we can. There we go. Fantastic. So we've got most people here, or sort of a bit of a split between yes and no. Actually, it's a little bit like the votes in Pennsylvania, isn't it? Sort of 50% yes and sort of 43% no, with a few folk not knowing. So, from there, if we can go to the next poll question, which is, what's the most important risk of remote working in your view during COVID-19? And we've got some choices here. If you can start voting, I'm sure you can all see them on the screen. And that's information security and data, culture, well-being and engagement, insider information, fraud and retention. And I will just click through these slides here. I'll give you all another moment to keep voting. Okay, that seems to have settled down, and we've got an outstanding majority for wellbeing and engagement. So we're going to kind of get into the next piece. So this is really over to our HR specialists. So Yinka, Michael, what do you believe are the risks to your businesses in respect to remote working? And also, has this changed or evolved during the pandemic? And maybe if we can go to Michael first.
Sure, thanks, Caroline. Yeah, really interesting poll result, because in many ways, engagement and well-being kind of define byproducts of lots of other risks as well. For example, as on their retention, etc. I think one of the key risks is if we think about the workplace, it isn't happenstance. The workplace is designed to maximize productivity in a fairly egalitarian way. Unless you're in one of those sort of older businesses where somebody has, a corner office and smokes cigars, pretty much it's designed to maximize our productivity and provide us with the facilities to work in the most productive way. There are natural risks with remote working, and remote working for us isn't a new thing. Many people have done it for years, but it's usually been a hybrid of, office and work. I think we lose that sort of equal playing field in terms of the work environment when you move to remote working. I know for many people, many of us, myself included, we have dedicated workspaces at home. That isn't the case for an awful lot of people who are working from home or working remotely. They don't have the peace and quiet and the studious work atmosphere and the facilities in order to maximize their productivity. And to be honest, even with my setup, I'm kind of at the mercy of my neighbour's lockdown desire to build a new extension, or the current lockdown, which isn't really a lockdown really, where everyone seems to be playing football at the park behind me. It doesn't necessarily maximize that productivity. And that's a big risk, because quite often you can be on anything from a board call to a webinar like this. And the next minute, it's crash bang, you can't concentrate, etc. So there are risks to productivity. And picking up on the well-being theme, it's much harder to connect with people in a meaningful way. Of course, we can use Zoom and MS Teams and all those things to keep in touch, but none of them really take the place of the uncoordinated, water cooler type chats, catching someone's eye, picking up on how they're genuinely feeling. I've been pumping out loads of mini engagement surveys. How do you feel today? How do you feel today? Etc. And I think you said something earlier, Caroline, about novelty. There was a bit of a novelty when this all kicked off. We were doing our weekly quiz. We were doing all those sorts of things. Now that's all kind of, oh God, I can't be doing a quiz anymore. Fed up of that. So how are we engaging with each other and, continuing with our cultural norms, if you like, when it's remote, it just takes a lot more effort. So I think it has some longer term risks to the business, and I think it also does affect potential retention as well. But we may come to that point later, actually. But I know that Yinka's organisation has done something quite different. So actually, it's quite interesting to hear what they've done in relation to what we've done, which is kind of muddle through, but hope to return one at some point.
Yeah. Yinka, would you like to share what you guys have been doing?
We have put in a very, I would say, we went through the model of over-communicating. By the time we went into the lockdown in March, I'd already written 2 pamphlets, as it were, on how to deal with the situation. What to do if you have COVID or you have some symptoms while you're in the office. Also, there was a mini one about what the government advises. And then partway through the lockdown, I created a lovely, incredibly, it was very, very long. I'm so proud of it because it was so long and it seemed quite good. A business continuity document, which really took into consideration all kinds of things. I think the biggest risk in my mind from this situation is really thinking that everybody's situation is very, very similar, where we need to actually have a different perspective and realize that each person's situation, their setup is very different, whether that is based on the individual's culture, whether it is their gender, whether it is their ethnicity or their race, how they identify. Lots of those things have played into how people have dealt with this situation, if they're living on their own or they're living with family. And the risk is, like I said, that we treat people as some kind of homogenous group. I mean, if we look at the statistics, there's a lot of stuff in the newspapers during the coronavirus about the Black population being particularly affected. But what's not often mentioned is it's actually the Bangladeshi and Pakistani that had the highest rates of infection and indeed deaths as a result of the coronavirus. So it's taken that into consideration. It's that people are different. If I was to split up the risks, I'll say there are 3 main ones. There's that well-being aspect. How are people doing on the emotional level? How are they feeling in their general well-being? And how we have done that within my company, within Game Analytics, is I quickly put it as one of our OKRs, our targets, as it were, whereby we, within the HR team, will reach out to each person at least once every fortnight. And that is reaching out to them via email, via Slack, just really seeing how they are doing. And it's this personal touch can't be replicated. It's what HR is there for. The second related to the physical risks. In terms of ergonomics, do people have the right chairs? Do they have the right equipment? And we dealt with that in a very systematic manner. I think it was after maybe 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe a month, I can't remember, we said that this is going to be long term. So we paid for individuals to go into the office and be able to pick up bits of furniture, particularly chairs, and we would pay for Ubers to go to and from the office. We would buy people equipment. We didn't want people to struggle during this. And the third aspect has been around culture. I suppose ensuring this overlaps with what Michael was saying, ensuring that we retained our staff members, that our staff members felt connected with one another. And I think this is where we have found it most difficult, to be completely honest. But of those, the biggest one is dealing with the emotional side, the well-being part of people, to be completely honest, because there are just so many aspects to that, so we can't pick every one of those up. And I think we can notice as HR directors or senior HR professionals that we've been awash with many companies and platforms that are trying to fill that gap of look after your employees, here are the well-being offers that are in place. So that's what we did, and I think we've covered it relatively well over this period.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that the sort of, I think the central, I think quite rightly, we are all concerned about the well-being of our teams and our wider staff. But I do think what's really interesting is that actually well-being is almost like the central sort of hub from which all the other risk spokes actually emanate from. I mean, I'm Michael, it's interesting what you're talking about, the quiz. We had quizzes. I'm still slightly wounded that the quiz that I prepared, which was on mythical beasts and winged creatures, was the last quiz we did. I think that might have been more about my topic choice than anything else. But we really did try and drive a lot of well-being and getting a lot of engagement. But I think my observation is certainly that sort of when people's well-being is affected, and that can be, for example, they're struggling to work from home, they've got distractions that may have occurred. It could be that they've got a personal situation that financially is stressful. That's where you start to see risks. It's where you start to see people perhaps not paying as much attention to things like information security policies. It may be where people start to get tempted to use access to information that they have in a way that perhaps they wouldn't normally. And of course, not being in an office means that it probably feels like it might be a little bit easier to go undetected. I think it's really interesting what you were both saying about sort of people having different setups. Again, one of the things that we've been thinking about is, a lot of folk will be living in shared houses where they're younger, or you may be, with your partner, and you may be living with people who are competitors. How do you keep that information confidential? At the end of the day, people can overhear conversations. We're all on Teams all day talking, so there's things that folk will overhear that we're perhaps again not maybe as mindful of, either through stress or just the fact that this has kind of become a new normal. So we become sort of less sort of on our mettle and worried. So. There's a few things I think that sort of, well-being, of course, being the core, but as I say, central hub to all those different spokes. So there's a few things I think that sort of generally we can do, which is, review any risk matrices that we've got. How should we be viewing risk? Do we need to make any changes? Having a look at things like who's got access to what information, do they still need it? We can really mitigate behind the scenes without kind of, making accusations or putting out any sort of, information security tools to monitor people. We can just actually have a look and see what people have got access to. Review all the training. Let's make our training a bit more modern and more pertinent to working from home. If you're off to the bathroom making a cup of tea, do Control-Alt-Delete still. You would if you were in the office. Do it when you're at home. And then, sort of obviously we'd say from a background screening perspective, consider continual screening or monitoring. If people have been out of the office for a long time, or if people have been on furlough, maybe we want to know kind of what they've been up to. Have they got any stresses or strains that we might need to take into consideration? Again, not to be used as a sword, but really to be used as some sort of shield, so that again we can pick up if there's changes in behaviours that could be driven by that well-being, that we can then address as HR professionals or as professionals in looking after our team, so that we can manage that risk. So I think we're going to go to another very exciting poll. I think maybe if we'd have asked this question probably yesterday morning, the answers might have been different, but now post-vaccine news, we may get a different result. But the question is, will employees ever return to the office? Yes, you believe that it's the best environment. Yes, but part-time. COVID-19 has at least shown us there's flexibility or necessity for that. Maybe, but it'll be very much a case by case. Or no, it's simply not necessary, or perhaps it's a no because it's just not fitting for your business, of your normal business practices. So we'll give everyone about 30 seconds to have a bit of a think about that and then vote. And to see what's happening on the poll. So really interestingly, the majority of people here are saying yes, but part-time, and that COVID-19 has shown us the necessity of flexibility in our approach. So sort of setting up our next question, really, which is, I've been kind of following the press, and, there's been a lot of chat within the either HR-focused press or the general, news, that the pandemic's actually fast-tracked around about 10 years of progress towards true flexible working for everybody. And really my question to first of all, Yinka, is do you agree with that? Do you think that we have fast-tracked?
I would say overall, it has fast-tracked working from home or remote working for most people. But, and as a result, we haven't had the time to prepare. And it has impacted certain groups more than others as a result, which is why I was stating earlier. One of the interesting studies is that, as we've all know, carers have been particularly affected, and even more so, mothers. There was one study done quite early on, one of the first, looking at output for researchers and papers being written by men and women, and there'd been a marked decrease in the number of papers which were being written and being published by women. And I think we will look at this time, it's been roughly a year, we'll look at some knowledge gaps from certain demographics as a result of this lockdown. It affected them more than others. So it's sped up. I don't think it's sped up in the way that anybody really wanted it to be. And I think I think it's actually exaggerated some of the inequalities which exist within the world of work. Those in the most precarious roles or in the most precarious jobs their roles have not been made any less precarious as a result of increase in remote working. It's those that have been in the most fortunate positions that have been able to move forward to remote working being a reality that they can do 9 to 5. I think that's one thing that we've noticed. If that was going to happen anyway, then I suppose it has moved things forward. I think overall it's created a bigger gap in who can get remote working and who isn't able to receive remote working overall.
And just in relation to that, with the type of business that you work within, what has your policy been in relation? Have you gone to full remote working? Are you going partial remote working, or have you taken a different approach?
We have taken what would be best described as a hybrid approach. We have some employees based in Denmark, and we have some employees based in the UK, in London and in Copenhagen. And the situation has been very, very different in how the governments have handled COVID-19. Our employees in Denmark, until about a month ago, were regularly going back into the office, whereas those in the UK, of course, we haven't been back. And during the entire period of the lockdown, we've had lots of communication with the team, and the team in London have decided they would like to get rid of the office and they would like to continue to work remotely, which means that we are going forward with a hybrid model, making things ever so slightly complicated. So those individuals based in London are going to be given some additional support in terms of benefits, in terms of reimbursements, and in terms of how we engage with them than those in Denmark. They're going to be managed, and we're going to work with them in a slightly different manner, different fashion. What the challenge for that is, of course, ensuring we don't give too much attention, or we're not seen as giving too much attention to the team in London, and that those in Denmark are somehow now losing out, not having this porous and very flexible work situation. And that is the balance now, ensuring that everybody feels like they're being heard and they're given, they're treated equitably, not equally across the organisation.
And Michael, I'm assuming it's quite different at London City Airport. It would be slightly, and Yinka's obviously got his entire London populace sort of going to be working from home. But of course, if our pilots and our security folk in the airports work from home, that would be a disaster. So from your perspective, do you believe that this is fast-tracked progress, and in what way have London City Airport sort of approached this and requested potentially for flexible working?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have a significant operational workforce where it's just not practical to work from home. But predominantly the back office function has been working from home for health and safety reasons predominantly, particularly during the early stages of the pandemic. I'm not sure I entirely buy with the premise of the question. You know, these are these things that kind of get thrown out there. You know, the pandemic is fast-tracked, 10 years of progress, blah, blah, blah. I think it's definitely turned the dial on the focus of, the standard focus of presenteeism versus outputs. I think it's forcing a lot more managers to start thinking for them in a different way about how they measure the productivity of what's going on in their teams, and to focus a little bit more on the outputs as opposed to, oh, I know someone's there, and they could be there going through the Argos catalogue for all you know. You've got no idea what they're doing. They're just physically in front of you. So that's a good thing about all of this. I think what's really interesting, and I think the poll results show this, I think there's a common kind of understanding that we will be entering a sort of a hybrid future where there's just going to be a lot more kind of in the office one couple of days, maybe out the office one day, etc., which was kind of how we were operating before this all kicked off. I think what's a more interesting question is how the office now needs to change. From a London City Airport point of view, I lovingly upgraded the office in February. I spent a lot of money on refurbishing and making it a great place to work from a physical standpoint. And as you can imagine, in the subsequent months, it's been butchered by a plethora of perspex everywhere, and literally screens and cubbies and all sorts of horrible things. I think there's a huge challenge on us to as much as we need to get the working from home physical situation right for people. We've actually got challenges as well back in the office now as to how you make the office a nice place to be. Like many people I'm sure on the call, we have all sorts of rules about how many people are allowed in the kitchen at any time to boil a kettle, how many people are allowed on the stairs, how many one-way systems, the perspex, as I've said. There's all sorts of things which are making the office a little bit unpleasant, to be honest. And we need to really think about, certainly during the transition phase, until this is kind of completely eradicated as a pandemic, how do we make the office as good a place to be that harnesses all the good stuff about being a collective within an office, and doesn't feel too sanitary and almost sanitized and almost kind of uncomfortable. So that's my view. I think, as I say, there's definitely been progress, and I think it's in that paradigm shift for some managers onto focusing on outputs as opposed to presenteeism.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it is interesting, when we before everything kind of turned around again, we were talking very much about how to get people back into the office. And one of the biggest challenges was well, how do you, one of the things that we felt has been a risk is, the difficulties in collaboration when you're on Teams. It's far more difficult to get your point across or get your voice heard, especially if, for example, you've got connectivity problems, which people do. But of course, going back into an office space where you're all wearing masks, or you're behind perspex, or you can't use the meeting rooms, that doesn't actually get you back to where you want to be. So how do you manage it? And what's your sort of path there? I think the other thing that's quite interesting is that, certainly, a lot of people, when they're looking to move jobs, one of the things that people thought about prior to COVID was, well, it's a real advantage if there's a flexible working model within the place I'm looking to move to. That would be a real advantage. But I think now it's more of an expectation about how do you build your benefits packages, where actually working from home is the norm. How do you get yourself that advantage? But one thing that I'm quite interested in, and I think, Yinka, you may have more of a view on this due to having your entire London workforce, now being home-based. And it kind of links to well-being, which is, some folk, of course, as we've noted, have very different living circumstances. So that inevitably means that some people will be separated quite significantly from their family members. And I know I've experienced, folk in my team asking if they're able to go and move back to sort of, where they grew up. And that could be, somewhere in Europe. I've got one team member who's from Africa. I've got another team member who's from America. And we don't, of course, always have office locations in all of those places. And the employment contract is still going to be with your home hub. So have you had to think about anything, for example, like risks of, your sales force working from a different country and business establishments being created accidentally, or personal tax issues? Have either of you had to think about those types of things, or have you seen an increase in folk asking to work from completely different locations, not just from home?
Yes, most definitely. That's been an issue. And I think that we in London we will notice this a bit more because we have such a cosmopolitan, a very diverse city, which is really held up by non-Londoners. I was going to say foreigners, but really just non-Londoners. It's rare to meet somebody who's born and grown up in London. And we have had a number of our team members go back to their home countries for extended periods of time during this COVID period. And what we have said is, we're quite used to this because we have somebody who's already based in Japan and we're working with him quite closely. And we have somebody else who's based in Brazil and another person who's based in Latvia anyway, prior to the pandemic. But what we have done is we've emphasized a lot of intra-team communication. So how teams communicate with one another. There's been some internal training which we've put together about that, about how to use Slack, email, video conference calling and all those other things in a more effective manner. That's how we have tried to manage that. Now, the second question about people maybe going to Europe for extended periods of time, and which, there's that situation of people creating a new workplace. That is another problem that we're facing. And what we have done, or what I've done in preparation for that, is those EU nationals, I've spoken to them as a group and individually, consulting with them because we still need to deal with Brexit, because Brexit has added another interesting flavor of complication to the situation. It's like that hors d'oeuvre on the buffet of problems. Is that I've had a very frank conversation with individuals, particularly, I think there's one person who is from one nation. We're sponsoring him to work in the UK, and now he wants to travel around Europe. It's a frank conversation about this is what is likely to happen, or this is what you need to be made conscious of. If you're going to be out of the UK for extended periods of time, then it's going to affect your ability to for permanent residency in the country. You need to update us on certain things about where you're traveling. And I've also received some legal advice on that. So for those specific cases, I've had to reach out for legal advice to ensure that the UK remains the base and they don't get employment rights from other places. Again, I've had to reach out and get some legal advice. What I found very useful, so that people can learn from my experience, is to ensure that you make your UK employment lawyer or firm be very aware of exactly what it is that you're doing, and also to contact, I would say, there is a very good department within within Gov.uk, which provides a list of various lawyers from around the world, and to engage with those lawyers in each of these countries, hopefully they're not that many, to give you advice on how to ensure that you don't take on this new unforeseen risk. So then you can have both lawyers communicating with each other, putting your company in the best position.
Absolutely. Michael, any sort of insights from you? I would imagine, again, you've probably faced that a little bit less, but
certainly not to the same scope, but we do have, I do have employees that have been based in Germany for many years. In fact, right now, one of the members of the senior team is working from home in South Africa for the next 3 months. I have another senior individual who's moved to France permanently. But actually, even on a local level, I was some of these practical issues and risks that are presenting themselves. I was on a call recently where somebody raised a really great question, which is just on the matter of expenses. Something most companies have. What is your home location now? What is your contractual location versus your actual home location? And therefore, what are the risks or tax issues involved in making claims from one location versus the other? I suspect that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's probably numerous other factors that we haven't really thought about, everything from our private medical insurance provision through to pension schemes, all sorts of things where different being based in different countries can necessitate different rules and regulations around those things. We're at the start, I think, on a more holistic basis. Don't get me wrong, lots of companies are very good at this and have huge insight into managing remote workers across the world. I think for smaller companies, and I would class us as a smaller company, we are just under 1,000 employees for the airport itself, so we're not big by any stretch. But for a number of smaller companies, I think we're now facing into these for the first time, because people are making those requests. They're saying, well, if I'm going to work remotely, and we've seen this in the property boom recently, why would I work, from this particular place? Why wouldn't I move to the seaside? Or why wouldn't I move to Whitstable? Nothing against Whitstable, by the way, but why wouldn't I go and live in Whitstable? Or if I'm going to go to Whitstable, why wouldn't I move to Switzerland? Or why wouldn't I move, et cetera, et cetera? And those, I think, is going to be a lot more common, those types of requests, and the associated risks that come with granting those requests and saying, yeah, you're right, you can work from there effectively. And as HR teams, I think it also will definitely increase our workload substantially, just in simple things. I mean, even for my employee in Germany, we have to go through quite a laborious process just to pay every month. It's quite challenging. It's not simple. Because probably of our size, but I suspect many organisations are the same. They're not necessarily set up for that type of broad payroll, international payroll setup.
Yeah, and I think initially, some of these requests that were coming through, especially to move to completely different, locations geographically, things were being dealt with very much on an ad hoc basis and based on, an analysis of somebody's personal circumstances. And I think, what we haven't done perhaps is actually have robust policies in place, because it becomes quite difficult if you allow one set of people to go and sort of work somewhere, how do you say no to somebody else? And a lot of it is down to kind of role types. I think also, as you say, we've all kind of sat there thinking, yippee, no office expenses. But of course, as you say, we all, all of our offices have free coffees, teas, biscuits if we're lucky. And, if people have been used to those types of things, where did the lines get drawn? So I think sort of just really to summarise this segment, I think work from home is now firmly out of the bag. There's certainly a lot of benefits for people and from a work-life balance perspective in theory. But of course, there's lots of implications, and perhaps a lot of those implications, as you said at the start, this fast-tracked through, and perhaps we didn't have the time and the space initially while we were focusing on the COVID implications. We've not necessarily focused on the long-term implications of this new hybrid world. So that's probably all of our next steps for 2021, I think. So going back to hopefully at some point with a vaccine, which means we don't have to have perspex and wear masks, our employees will hopefully start to return to the office, unless we've of course made decisions that we're going to go firmly to full home working. And especially as the economy regains momentum, we're going to start to see hiring recommence. So we're going to have a lot of people either coming back into an existing workplace, or people who are going to be, looking for new opportunities, who have previously been furloughed or potentially been made redundant. And that means they'll be working into a new workplace. So when folk are coming back, in particular where there's sort of, potentially a period of around, 9 months or maybe longer, where they've not actually had any work experience or work activity, what do you consider to be the risks when those individuals either return into the existing workspace, or potentially if you are hiring that individual? Michael, I think particularly for you guys, because you'll be, of course, concerned with security, perhaps if you could take this one first.
Sure. Well, we did actually face into this when the first lockdown occurred, and the flights literally decreased by about 95% overnight. We took a bit of a radical step. We actually closed the airport. We closed it for about 3 months. Now, it was definitely the right thing to do, not just from a health and safety perspective, but also it enabled us to physically get the workplace ready for reopening for both customers and staff. However, it did present a challenge. Firstly, there's currency of training, particularly for heavily governanced as we are by the Civil Aviation Authority and the DFT. We needed people to undergo that retraining all over again to make sure that they were up to speed and that they were still able to spot things that they need to spot when they x-ray things, and also just more practical issues around making sure that people were physically up to speed with some of the physical rigors of the job. It's interesting, we did a lot of work with our partner called Back in Action, who do a lot of work with musculoskeletal type work with our workforce. It was a really big issue because once you're out of condition, even for a couple of months, you'd be surprised how it can lead to issues, physical issues. So it kind of hits the physical as much as the training aspect as well. So bringing people back, we also had to undergo a whole host of reconditioning in so much as this is now where we can walk, this is now where we can't walk, this is how we must operate within the physical environment, all sorts of things. And lastly, just in terms of just picking up on something that is probably more nuanced to my sector, but again, it may affect some others as well, is, this is a very trying time financially for a lot of people within the sector. Even on 80% pay, a number of frontline operational workers in particular, although it can affect all levels, do live paycheck to paycheck. And that puts them at risk of, being approached by interested parties, be they terrorists or any other parties, to, exchange information for cash, etc. All of those things are quite important within our sector to be on top of. So we have to really think through a number of, quote, returning to work issues that affected us. And lastly, one more thing. I think even for the back office, people returning to the back office, the other issue that we're having to contend with is there have been instances where individuals perhaps have been used to a level of freedom about when they work. So that sort of necessity to compress back into the 9 to 5 potentially hasn't gone down very well, understandably, particularly if you've got childcare at home, as Yinka mentioned, or you're just used to having flexibility within the freedom within the framework to deliver your outputs whenever you want. I mean, I'm an early morning person. You call me at 4 o'clock, I'm dead to the world. But there are other people who are just getting started. Do you know what I mean? When you take all of that freedom and flexibility away and you now say, okay, it's now back to the office and the office is kind of operating from 9 to 5, that's another risk. And it leads on to, and I'll probably sound like a broken record, but I think it does lead on to this retention risk. So I'd be very interested to kind of see how retention is affected by the ways of working changing over the next sort of embedding, if you like, over the next 6 months, vaccine or not.
Yeah, I agree. I'm the opposite to you. I'm a bit like Kevin the teenager in early mornings, but become much more sprightly in the evenings. But yeah, I agree. Sort of how people's flexibility and being able to allow work to sort of meld a little bit around the other things that they may want to do in their day or how we work best, because essentially I think you made the point at the start, Michael, about sort of the office is really there to drive productivity. So if you're outside of the office, you still need to be productive. Everyone is productive at different times of the day. So losing that and people going back into the office could actually then have a negative impact on that productivity. So how do we keep that going? And how do we allow people to have those preferences without, the person you sit next to is the early bird. If you're the sort of night owl going, well, they didn't turn up till 10 o'clock. It can cause tensions with back in the office. Yinka, I mean, of course, for yourselves in London, you are not going back into the office. So I in terms of a return to the workspace, that's not something for you guys necessarily to consider. But Michael picked up on something really interesting about sort of, understanding people's background and pressures that people are under. Is that something, if you're going to be hiring new members of staff, how will you approach that hiring? Will you be more cautious, or do you think that it's going to be business as normal?
Before I answer this, I want to go back to something that you and Michael were just discussing earlier about different biometrical rhythms that we have. So this was tackled quite early on in the company. And what I advised, I cannot for the life of me remember what the term is. It is, I don't know, it's like a focus less on the hours that the person does and more on the productivity. It's something that was introduced a very, very long time ago by GAP, I think in the 80s or in the 90s, long time by work standards. And that is what I have really been emphasizing with our managers. We're focusing on people's productivity, not necessarily the hours that they are able to provide to, especially because we want them to be flexible. Now, the problem with that is we obviously still need to have, there needs to be some overlap to ensure there's teamwork. And what we have done is we have some core hours. And so those core hours were, I think we had maybe like 4 or 5 core hours, particularly at the beginning, as people were maybe slightly more stressed. And as I noticed that there was a tendency for burnout, this is when we started emphasizing, look, people, we really need you to be very flexible with when you start and end work, and you just have to be notify your team members of when you will be on through the Slack status bar. And we found that to be quite helpful. The second thing you mentioned was to do with reward. And I think I mentioned this before in one of our conversations when we're planning this, is I think this is where we're going to notice a big demarcation of companies, those that have reviewed their total reward package and have updated it for this new world of work where flexible working is going to be the norm, or it's going to be common enough to be almost considered the norm, and also to provide something else. So, for example, cycle to work scheme. That's quite good. That's nice. Some of the other benefits companies had before were like pantry or lots of goodies. That's pretty useless right now. And so companies need to get rid of those things and substitute them with something else. And I don't think companies have recognized this. I'm still surprised at the list of benefits that companies put out on their job adverts. It's just, it needs to change. It's quite an odd thing. Now, the other question you asked, which, Caroline, you're going to have to remind me because I've forgotten in between everything. What was it, please?
No, lost the button there. It was really whether or not you're going to be changing your hiring patterns. Just a little bit conscious of time though, because we are sort of getting on. So if you could very quickly just say whether or not you're going to be changing sort of how you hire folk, that'd be fabulous.
Yes, of course. We are not changing how we hire people. I think within the recruitment and selection process, it is more greater guidance to our candidates on how to deal with and how to go through a remote interview, and similarly for those that will be on the interview panels. That's the main change.
Fantastic. And I think, it is really interesting. I think, there's lots of questions, things like, can you ask if someone's been on furlough when you're getting an employment reference? It's still technically you're employed. Can you ask that level of information? What Michael talked about in terms of financial pressures and how that can drive different folks' behaviour. Incredibly interesting. There's a lot of debate in the United States, for example, at the moment around whether or not you should actually discount anybody's bad credit during the pandemic period. I think in the UK it would be very driven by sector and what the risks are relating to that sector. And I think every company, it's something that they need to think about. But before we go into the Q&A, we're going to do a very quick poll and then have 10 minutes for the Q&A at the end. And the final question in the poll is, when you return to the office, what will be your priority? And if you could all vote now. So we're looking at retraining, reiteration of your core values, health and well-being, rescreening or screening of existing staff on their return or when you hire somebody, or, as Michael's talked about quite a lot, retention and how do you retain your folk when they're coming back. We'll just give you a couple of seconds to answer that poll. Let's see how we're going. Really interesting results here, and I think this has been really core to the entirety of this webinar, is that the focus is still very much on people's health and well-being on the return to the office and the transitions that everybody's been through. I actually think that that's quite nicely linked to the reiteration of core values. Perhaps that's going to be something that we start to see as being a core value of companies. We very much focus, maybe that's a big change, focus on service mindset, collaboration, grounded in respect. Perhaps one of our core values going forwards as organisations is going to be the health and well-being of our team members. So I think we're going to go to the Q&A session now. We have got a question for Michael from Ella. Michael, do you worry at all about over-communicating with your team by asking them to do lots of surveys, or are you quite comfortable?
Oh gosh, no! I never worry about over communicating. That would be wonderful if we had that problem. No, and I should clarify. I mean, we're not. What I was comparing there is we like most employers, we do sort of the big survey twice a year type thing. These are very short form stacks that I'm sending out. They're kind of 4 or 5 questions, almost like heat surveys. So they're not major. They take probably about a minute for people to answer, just to get a sense of how people are feeling at any one time. And there are lots of providers, like Butterfly and other providers that, will do those kind of heat maps for you. But gosh, no, never worry about over communicating. What's that story about that company that won the prize for the best communications in People Management magazine years ago? And on the way out, they asked the receptionist, "What could you do better around here?" And she said, "Communication." So there you go. Never worry about over communicating.
Absolutely brilliant. Yinka, this one I'm going to put to you because we talked a little bit about monitoring performance, but we've got a question from Jenny, and that is, are you using monthly metrics to monitor performance for those working from home? And we did touch on this. How you've talked very eloquently about sort of not looking at hours but looking at output, and how are you actually doing that, and how are you doing it effectively when you haven't got folk in the office?
Yes, it's something we had thought about doing at the beginning, having some kind of mark figure for a number of hours, and we realized it probably wouldn't be that useful for us because the majority of people were hitting their targets and relatively well. I think the main issue for most people, most companies, is actually burnout amongst their employees as opposed to lazy employees. And so our focus has really been in those. We have just focused on better targets, better use of OKRs, better use of KPIs, and better objectives and so forth with it. And those are what we're looking at. Those are what we are using to measure people's performance, not their hours. We're not monitoring them so closely because there is enough stress in the world. There is enough that they have to deal with without feeling like they're being watched and they're being monitored in this very, very strange situation that we're all in.
Perfect. And sort of slightly changing tack is something that we covered in one of the questions just very briefly. But Michael, you mentioned that you did have a couple of folk that have worked, I think, from Germany or France for some time now. And one of the questions from Simone is, did you have to set up a branch to allow that staff member to work from the different location? And they've just had the request and just interested to know what you did.
No, we didn't set up a branch. The France one is actually quite recent. That was authorised in only 2 months ago. So for now, we're still managing like a UK employee, but obviously paying into a UK bank account. The German one's slightly different. The German one, we pay through a third party who then converts and pays the individual, but essentially they're still based at London City. I think those sorts of things are easy to do when you've literally got 3, 4, 5 people. I think once we start getting larger volumes and more requests, I think it will become more of a challenge. And having to set up remote branches will probably be something we'll need to face into if we reach that stage.
Yeah. And then a question for Yinka, to be really interesting, from Louise. What ideas do you have to replace benefits for home working? You mentioned, it's no longer the fully stocked pantry is not going to lure people in, so we've got to buy our own snacks. I rue the day that our office manager a couple of years ago, she liked snacks, she resigned, and we lost our very large, gigantic treats. So I've been upset since. But in terms of replacement of those benefits, what sort of ideas do you have, or any suggestions?
This is actually what I've been looking at in a bit of detail. I would say you need to consider what exactly is being offered in the general market for your sector and for your group of people that you want to hire, and also what benefits you offer that will match your company values or your company values and where your company wants to be seen. So what we are doing is we are going to give people some time off, or a bit more time off than usual, simply because if you take off I don't know, if you take off a week and you were to stay at home, it doesn't quite feel the same. So we have given people a few more days around the seasonal period. This is something we're considering, giving people time off from the 24th of December to the 2nd of January, for example, so that they can just focus on relaxing, and that's not going to be taken out of their benefits. Another thing that we're thinking of, that we're doing, is we are focusing more on well-being packages for people. And I think something else which I'll be quite interested to do for the team is giving them, to make it incredibly flexible, giving them almost like a well-being budget. So you have £30 a month to spend in any way that you think will make you feel better. Whether this is to get a manicurist, I know we can't quite do that right now, or it is to roll over to save up for a massage therapist later on, something like that. So it's very, very individual, and it's very specific to the person and what they need. I can't determine what you need to feel better, only you can do that.
Yeah, and I think that nicely sort of focuses on sort of well-being. One final question, very, very briefly, probably a yes/no answer for both of you. Most companies are running up to appraisal season. They're hard enough as it is face-to-face. If we're not back in the office, how have you got any sort of particular concerns in terms of appraisal season coming up? And how do you go about it when you've not seen people for 9 months, not properly anyway? Michael, thoughts from you? Any concerns?
Well, just briefly. Well, firstly, I'm just working out how many bottles of wine I can buy with Yinka's £30 allowance per month. So I think that's going to be a thing I look forward to. But I think funny enough, I think appraisals are going to be slightly easier. And that's because I think working from home engenders in the main more trust. It's based on trust a lot of the time, unless you're doing nefarious practices that we have read about, to be fair, of people, having to check in at certain times and monitoring movements and everything else. Ultimately, it's a trust-based exercise, and that underpins performance reviews. So performance reviews via Microsoft Teams, in our case, I think are going to be slightly easier because there's been a lot of trust, two-way trust over the last 6 months. And I think that will help.
Perfect. And Yinka, very quickly, anything that you've got to add, anything else, or is that quite well summarised?
It is. I would just say, don't give up on those quizzes. Be adventurous in terms of ways in which your team can really get to know each other. Right now, we are doing lots of drawing challenges. And I'm surprised at how much people love that. We are playing poker on a weekly basis. And again, I'm surprised how many enthusiasts we have for poker. And the week before, we tried murder mystery. And again, it seemed to work. So just really be open, and your team would appreciate it.
Yeah. I had a drawing up on my wall in my office back in the days when we were in an office, done by my own fair hand. I'm not very talented at drawing. And one of our team members asked me how old my child was. They guessed around 3 to 4. So I don't think I'll be winning any of your competitions, unfortunately, Yinka. So, yeah, never mind. But that was fantastic. Thank you both so much, Michael and Yinka. So informative, so interesting, and hopefully everybody has got something out of this. I think we can probably follow up with questions if any are submitted via the team. But I just want to say thank you again and hand back over to Finn for some final housekeeping.
So much. I'd like to remind everyone that's watching today to complete the survey, and if they would like to go back to the session, it's available to access on demand. And once again, I'd like to thank you for viewing and thanks for taking part.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.